This episode of Intelligent Medicine is brought to you by the Fresh Pressed Olive Oil Club. Did you know that olive oil is at its peak of flavor and nutrition right after it's fresh pressed at harvest time? That's why my favorite olive oil is delivered to me direct from the latest harvest, thanks to the Fresh Pressed Olive Oil Club. And now you can try a bottle yourself, normally $39, for just $1, with no obligation to buy anything else. Visit myfavoriteoliveoil.com. In my case, it truly is myfavoriteoliveoil.com. myfavoriteoliveoil.com. Welcome to today's Intelligent Medicine podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Ronald Hoffman, and today we're going to discuss a subject that is a very important subject, very controversial, not discussed too often, although we touched upon it here from time to time on Intelligent Medicine. It's the fallout of modern technology, i.e., the radiation that we're exposed to from multiple sources, from cell phone towers, from our devices, from all the radio waves that may impinge on our physical bodies. We know that a lot of our processes in our brains and our hearts are electrical, and impulses course throughout our bodies in virtually every cell, and yet we're exposed continually to low-grade and sometimes high-grade electromagnetic fields. And to help us out with the discussion is a guy with actually quite a lot of background in the field of electronics, in the telecommunications industry. I believe he formerly worked for Bell Labs in the heyday of innovation, when they were first coming out with the notion that we could have mobile phones. I believe that was in the 1970s, first invented in the 1980s, more and more research, and finally it's become a ubiquitous item in our society. He's Daniel T. DeBaun. Am I pronouncing your name correctly?
That is correct.
Okay. And that's spelled D-E-B-A-U-N. And he has a great new book called Radiation Nation. And this book is excellent because it's very factual. It explains in layman's terms what's going on. And it also provides a bit of a history of the telecommunications industry and the history of the controversy surrounding these devices. So it's a great pleasure having you on Intelligent Medicine. Welcome.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Ronald. I really appreciate you giving us an opportunity to share with your community the insights that maybe we want to look for around modern technology and its fallout. Thank you again for inviting me.
Sure, my pleasure. So, well, first of all, how did you get involved in concern about the physiological effects of electromagnetic fields, coming from a telecommunications background?
It was a great question. It was back 5 years ago or so, maybe 6. My wife was watching my sons, and they had their laptops on their lap. And she said, "That can't be good for you." They were doing it for hours at a time. Now, she's not in the science community, but I was. And I instantly realized, based on my background, as you pointed out, I ran the laboratories in Bell Labs way back when on these electronics as they were being developed. So I was quite familiar with what the spectrum of problems could be. So she says it's a problem. So I said, well, let's go find something to fix that so my sons are protected. And believe it or not, couldn't find the kind of stuff that really did protect you. So I put together the various technologies, and I built them a product to protect their groin area. Uh-huh. And the rest is history. The reason I wrote the book was even more interesting, and what I found was there was a lot of disconnect in the science communities, disconnect to the public, a lot of misinformation out in the marketplace. And what we wanted to do is try to help you understand what it really is and what it's not. It's not a thing of panicking about it. It's a thing of being aware. Mm-hmm. And also is true, we learned a lot over the last 20 some odd years in the science community about the problems. And that didn't seem to be public domain information. So I thought it was pretty important. Now,
so,
give you an idea.
Excuse me, I want to just break in with an observation, and this is like anecdotal. This is not a study. This is not double-blind placebo research. But anecdotally, I will tell you that I'm very perplexed by a patient that I have currently who was diagnosed with endometrial cancer. She is postmenopausal, but she has none of the typical risk factors for endometrial cancer. She's been on an impeccable diet for the last 30 years. She has no strong family history. She's not obese. She's not metabolic syndrome. She didn't take hormones, no hormone replacement therapy. But in questioning her, we finally got around to the question, do you use electronic devices? And she said, indeed, I do. And she said, I'm an inveterate laptop user. And by that, I mean, it sits on my lap. And that's within literally inches. And you're concerned about your kids. Well, maybe some people think that's just some form of paranoia. But, eventually during this podcast, we'll speak to the issue of, is there evidence that proximity to these devices can be carcinogenic?
There's virtually no question whatsoever that there is direct correlation and evidence in the scientific community that identifies specific outcomes of problems associated with exposures. Mm-hmm. For the laptop, it was 25% of the male sperm count is immobile after about 3 to 4 hours. And what you were just talking about in terms of having these concerns because they're not traditional symptoms is also occurring more and more often. In fact, as you know, there's an oxidative stress to a toxin. Mm-hmm. Well, electromagnetic radiation is a toxin.
Right.
So your body's reacting to that
sunlight itself is a form of electromagnetic radiation.
In the spectrum.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's in the spectrum. And as is an X-ray. All of these things are in the same spectrum. And where before we didn't have much knowledge, nor did we have much problem, all of a sudden, and I'll give you a time frame, in 2005, 1/3 of the country, or 1/3 of the world had cell phones. Mm-hmm. Today, 96.8, 100% have cell phones. Mm-hmm. So all of a sudden, over the last 10 years, we've been bombarded with emissions, and all of a sudden now we're seeing in the clinical space evidence of the problems being created as a result of it, and we need to be aware of it.
Indeed. So give us a little primer on this, because, I mean, it's all mysterious, what's coming out. I mean, I think there's a couple of issues, because for one, there seems to be a heating effect of these devices if held close to the ear or held close to the brain. But there's also the EMF effect, which is a different frequency, I guess. And then there's the issue of, does it matter if the phone's on or the phone's off? It doesn't matter if the phone is not near your head, but you've got your, whenever I go to a new location, I always look for, I want to get online. And I see that there's 40 different options that my phone is picking up. That means my body's being bombarded. Right. Whether I give it the password or not, that stuff is out there.
Yeah, exactly. And let's talk more about that, because really that's what's the ADHD kind of influence to the body that you're hearing about these days from electromagnetic radiation. But let's talk about what it is first.
Sure.
It's not created in nature. There is a 6 to 12 hertz DC low frequency emission. That's called extremely low frequency emission. That's generated by the Earth.
Earth's magnetic field.
We're not talking about that. That is a electromagnetic field. Mm-hmm. When you have wiring running in your wall, when that's current flowing, there is 60 hertz electromagnetic radiation.
And that's, by the way, that's not even cell phone related. That's AC, alternating current.
Yeah. Alternating current, and it's entering into the room, and it could influence the body. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because an alternating current is precisely the way that you set up radio waves.
Well, you can have a digital signal as well.
Okay.
Where it's a constant load, but you're right. Alternating current actually does make it, in science we know it makes it more problematic. So we have the byproduct of emissions from technology that's around us. It's not intended to do anything. It's just being emitted. Your refrigerator, the motor inside is emitting electromagnetic radiation at 60 hertz. And then there's the other that man creates, which is communicating, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, connections to the cell tower. That's an RF signal. And that RF signal is being generated for communications typically. And so we have both of those you need to be worried about. Now you mentioned something about thermal.
Yeah.
A microwave oven runs at, and you don't need to remember the details. It's a 2.3 gigahertz signal. And when you put a piece of meat inside an oven, the water between the cells heat up, and they oscillate the cells.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden your meat's cooked.
Yeah.
That is around 2 gigahertz. Cell phones and Wi-Fi work around the 1 to 2 gigahertz range. So it is a thermal emitting signal. And it's known to be. The power levels are less, obviously. It's not the same as a microwave, but they're less. What we're learning in science is that low-level emissions of an RF signal can not only have a thermal impact, but a biological as well. And the standards, believe it or not, only protect you from the thermal impact. When they defined the standards over 30 years ago.
In other words, they don't want you to get burned by your device, and they say, well, as long as you know they hold a thermometer up to the temple of someone with a cell phone, and it only went up a half a degree, so that's not a big deal. You know, that's we're not going to have like first and second degree burns from that.
Right, and that's it's literally true. It was for a 6-foot male.
Yeah.
And what that signal is allowed to penetrate the head of a male, 6-foot male, by 1 inch, and heat up by 2 degrees. That was the standard set over 30 years ago.
Nothing to see here, folks. Just move along. Right.
Right. But Doc, you think about this.
Yeah. What
happens to an immature brains and the membranes of a child that's 5 years old? That goes completely through their head. That's what happens to that signal. So you do need to be worried about the biological impacts as well as the thermal impacts, and they are known to be the kind of exposures that can impact the cell. And as you know, it's typically oftentimes referred to as oxidative stress to the cell. When it's under oxidative stress, what happens? The membrane sort of becomes weakened. When the membrane weakens, the cell itself is penetrated by calcium. Calcium builds up, and the oxide builds up in the cell, and all of a sudden it mutates. It's damaged DNA. So that is known in science. In fact, recently last year, the National Toxicity Program, which is a division of the federal government, they did a study. They took cell tower transmitters, and they had a clean environment in an epidemiology study. And what they found was excess exposure increases the probability by 2% of frontal lobe cancers and heart cancers, believe it or not.
Which are very unusual kind of cancer. That's the tumors of the heart muscle. Very,
everyone was really surprised in the industry that was true, but because we didn't really realize that. But the electrical component of that, we're only talking about the cell impact, right? We're not talking about the process impact. If you're sleeping at night and you have a cell phone next to your head, and you have problems going to sleep, what's the problem? It's not the weakening cell because of the oxidative stress that the cell's under. It's the process of creating melatonin that's the problem.
Well, it's a derangement of brain processes because, as we know, one of the most in vogue new psychiatric tools, which is being touted for its benefit in the treatment of depression and OCD, is what's called transcranial magnetic stimulation. Now, this is with a therapeutic intent, but basically nothing enters the brain. You basically put a helmet on, and the magnetic emanations of the helmet kind of rearrange your brain networks, hopefully, and they're doing more research to get precision with this, in a way that can reboot your brain. But imagine, chaotic impulses from a phone or electronic device at a much lower amplitude, because we're not talking about, a helmet with powerful magnets in it. But we're talking about, some subtle magnetic emanations very close to the brain with perhaps, maybe you won't get brain cancer, maybe you won't get glioblastoma, but maybe it could have an effect on your sleep quality or your performance or your memory consolidation and so on.
Headaches, eye aches, all of those are directly linked to electromagnetic radiation. You are making a good point. In the practice of science, there are emerging technologies that are being applied to using electromagnetic radiation as a form of a repair of the body. And believe it or not, I often talk to experts in that space because they're worried about exposures. Are they exposing them too long? And they call us to ask us about our point of view. And what I always point out is we're not worried about the instantaneous small duration exposure to the cell. We're worried about the long duration, the long exposure. That's really where the dangers lie. And that was the point you were just making. A cell phone is used for 15 minutes, maybe half an hour, cumulatively maybe a couple hours a day. That's when the exposures are serious.
But the Wi-Fi is on continuously, and people may sleep within, 2 or 3 feet of their Wi-Fi, Wi-Fi unit.
Yeah, that is serious no-nos, because they're long duration. They're 8 hours of exposure. Never have those kinds of any transmitting devices in a room at night. You want to make at least 20 foot away from you to be safe. But with the cell phone, when you turn on your cell phone, what potentially could be the transmitters? You could have a cell tower transmitter. You can have a Wi-Fi transmitter. You can have a Bluetooth transmitter, and you have extremely low frequency emissions at DC at 60, or it's typically below 300 hertz, and so you have potentially 4 transmitters going into your brain. Not one like the standard, but 4. So a good practice typically is turn them off if you don't use them.
Indeed.
Turn your Bluetooth off. Turn your Wi-Fi off if you're not using it.
So
go ahead. I'm sorry.
I have concerns about a new trend, which is these VR headsets that are becoming very popular. And, for me, it's just a kind of vertigo-inducing aversive experience. But for some people, this type of experience is truly immersive. Kids love it. And I think it's really going to catch on. And I see people with these goggles on. And they're going directly into the eye, and they're wireless. I think they're Bluetooth devices. They are
Bluetooth devices. Bluetooth is 1.9 gigahertz. It's roughly the same space as a cell phone. Less strength. The energy levels are smaller, but the durations are longer and longer. What's interesting about the science community is we've differentiated the differences between a Wi-Fi impact to the cell versus a cell phone impact to the cell kind of strength. It's roughly the same spectrum of the emission spectrum, but we don't differentiate. So I always suggest make it equal. It is less, but we know it's still a thermal limiting signal. Mm-hmm. So you need to be aware. And so to the point you're making, when I see Wi-Fi or for that matter, Bluetooth being used close to the body, I see it as concerning as I do an RF signal touching a tower.
Recently, there was
long duration.
Recently, there was a case report of women with unusual cancers, young women with unusual cancers. You know, generally women can develop breast cancer in their teens or 20s, but it's rare. Generally, it's a problem of middle-aged and older women. And these women developed highly aggressive cancers with unusual pathology. Yep. And what they had in common was, and we see this from time to time, the women who go to the gym and they tuck their cell phone, in their décolletage, right next to the breast tissue.
You know that's soft tissue, and if you sort of correlate what we know from the recent epidemiology study, it's soft tissue that's impacting, and the breast is soft tissue as opposed to a hand. You never hear anybody die of electromagnetic radiation exposure to a hand.
Yeah, you're right. You don't get hand cancer, right? Yeah,
right. You don't hear that. But all of a sudden, we're getting all these rare. Remember, the frontal lobe cancers is fairly sort of trending higher than it's ever before.
Right.
Over the last 10 years, it's 2% per year, compounded every year.
Is there? If you look at this is a very controversial area. On the one hand, certain organizations point to hazards. I think World Health Organization has said something about this. But on the other hand, the telecommunications industry is very monolithic and powerful and well-funded.
Right.
And they undertake studies which say, hey, nothing to see here, folks. This is a safe technology. Let's just go. Don't be alarmed.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. There are factions in the marketplace that have influence in their space. We have the science community. The World Health Organization, for example, they rate an RF signal as a category 2B carcinogenic. That's, by the way, if you don't know your science. Mm-hmm. So they know it to be a potentially endangering signal. Mm-hmm. There are world organizations that literally are looking at all the sciences and studying those sciences and trying to have a collective view of what's going on at that time. That's the Bio Initiative group that's out of U.S., and they're doing wonderful work. But at the same time, if you look at the data coming out of the studies that are driven by the industries, they seem to say there's no danger. But there doesn't seem to be much science behind it. I'll give you a story about sort of the what's in that space from a political perspective.
Can we keep our audience in suspense on that? Let's hold that for part 2 because we divide our podcast into 2 parts.
Let's do that.
We're talking today to Daniel DeBaun. That's spelled DeBaun, and he's got a great new book, Radiation Nation. It's really very informative, and it's such a it's kind of a weird topic, and and I'll confess, Daniel, I was a little when I first was pitched with this story. I said, well, here's another alarmist, coming up with some maybe poorly scientifically documented screed against EMFs. And I have to say that it's balanced. It's scrupulously written. There's a great history of the industry. It's a great way, I think, for listeners to intelligent medicine to acquaint themselves with this issue. So I recommend it very highly, Radiation Nation. And is the book out already?
Oh, yeah. It has been out for a while.
Okay, great.
Since the beginning of the year.
The usual sources. And do you have a website, by the way?
We do. It's DefenderShield.com, and you can get the book there. Or you can go to radiationnationbook.com, and you can buy it from there as well.
Okay, in part 2 also, we're going to talk about solutions, and I especially want to hear about this so that I can protect myself and family members from the potential hazards of EMFs. I'm Dr. Ronald Hoffman, and this is the Intelligent Medicine Podcast.